All right. How's everyone doing tonight? Welcome to another colloquium, joint effort of the Stockton area Atheists and Freethinkers and the Stanislaus Humanists. Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm not sure where all the protesters are. You know, we're expecting those every other month, and they seem to just have died off.
God rules!
There's one back there. But I did find it rather fitting. You know, a year ago we had Matt McCormick out here. He said he would be back. He prophesied that he would return. And unlike other prophecies, this one came true. So thank you, Matt, for coming back today. We really do appreciate that. And yet, others from the community aren't here, but that's okay. We certainly welcome them anyway, and thank you all for being here. This is, like I said, a joint effort from the Stockton area Atheists and Freethinkers and the Stanislaus Humanists. How many people do we have from Stanislaus County tonight? Wow, that's great. And from San Joaquin County? All right, about half and half. That's perfect. I want to thank both of our groups and all the volunteers, especially those of you who got here a little early to help us set up all the chairs, the table. Who brought the delicious cookies? Thank you so much. And the coffee, too. Thank you for the coffee as well. And also want to thank the Manteca Library for letting us use this facility over and over again. And Matt McCormick, of course, for driving all the way down here from Sacramento to be with us one more time. Yes. Is there anybody that's new? I know I see a lot of familiar faces. We've got one new person. Well, sir, welcome to the group. But for everyone's benefit, you know, the two groups that we have here, we are all about building a community for the local atheists, non-believers, humanists, skeptics, agnostics, Pastafarians, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have social events. We have things like book clubs and our brunches and our drinking skepticallys. We have education and information and activism type activities like we're doing tonight, letting you know a little bit more. It's always good to learn, I think. And so all kinds of upcoming activities and events. I hope you guys get a chance at some point to regularly check our schedules, our calendars, for things like the coffee and brunch that we have in the Modesto and in Stockton, the karaoke that we have in Modesto, the crafts and the cooking stuff that we do in Turlock, and is it Salida or somewhere around there? The book club, what's that?
Manteca.
Manteca, excellent. The book club, thank you for hosting that. Game nights that we have, and family events, and volunteering, and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, other upcoming colloquiums too. So every other month, every odd numbered month, we do these. We have coming up, Richard Carrier is coming to the Manteca Library in May, and Greta Christina will be her first time coming here in July. We're really looking forward to both of those. And in September, Professor Dr. Julia Sankey from CSU Stanislaus will be here. And I don't remember, but we have November book as well, right?
Yes.
And who's that?
Catherine Borges.
Catherine Borges.
Yes.
Wonderful. And I do want to remind everybody about the biggest event that Northern California, actually anywhere in California, sees once a year, just for us free thinkers, is Sacramento Free Thought Day. It will be at the Capitol steps again this year. And that was a picture from last year's crowd. Over 300 people went to that. I hope you guys can make it this year. Completely free event. And of course, there's a fundraiser event the night before. We'll be announcing all the speakers and all of that pretty soon. If you have extra spare time, we could always use your help. Both the Stockton group and the Stanislaus group, we need help. We need help with events and hosting and promoting and marketing and financial support and all of that kind of stuff. And so if you're inclined to help us out in any of those ways, please get in touch with myself, Troy, Freedom, anybody who's running these events, and we can definitely put you to work. We'll take your money and put it to good use as well. And to remind you about our website, the Stockton Stockton area and Atheist Freethinkers, whatever, is at stocktonaaf.org, and the Stanislaus Humanists.org as well. So there they are, and then they're on Meetup too. And there's the slide about supporting all of these events. I've already given that speech. So my last reminder is about Camp Quest. Camp Quest is the secular summer camp for children of ages 8 to 17. Registration is already open and has been for a couple months, and they are about 2/3 full. And so if you're a parent with a kid ready to go to Camp Quest this summer, you better get that kid registered right away, because it will fill up like it did last year. And you can get more information about Camp Quest at campquest.org. We're also looking for volunteers, and so if you want to be a kid again and help other kids learn about science and humanism, and the great outdoors, leadership, all of that fun stuff, then please get in touch with me right away, because we'll be having our training weekend coming up any moment now. And so, without further ado, it is my pleasure to bring back to the stage, Matt McCormick. Matt is a professor of philosophy over at Stanislaus, at CSU Sacramento. He's the author of Atheism and the Case Against Christ. He is a blogger. His blog is called Atheism, Proving the Negative, and he has well over 50 different lectures available on his YouTube channel. This is a cover of his book. I keep telling him to bring it so he can sell it, but it is available on Amazon.com. And I love this. I was looking for the reviews. Check this out. He has 4.5 out of 5 stars, which is absolutely impressive. So kudos to you, Matt, for putting that together. But I wanted to read this particular review to you because I found it kind of funny. It was a 1-star review, the only 1-star review. And it says, I have read the book, albeit 'twas an unpleasant chore, to find out what these new atheists are ranting about, to try and attack/undermine Christianity. All I got was pure speculation and mere assumption, and occasionally a bit of preposterous lies. Lies, Matt. Basically, I was not impressed by the author's vain attempts to mock the Bible's teachings. Especially since it's an impossible task, as stated in 2 Corinthians 13:8, and then it goes on with the quote from the Bible. So, with that introduction, let's welcome Mr. Professor Matt McCormick.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back and talk. It's a little bit of a letdown outside. If you were here last year, I have a little bit of PTSD about it. There were like 300 people outside, and they were protesting with signs and chanting and speaking in tongues and singing. They circled the building to pray away the demons. And you got to know some of the backstory here. When I left, I was by myself. I had to park like 3 blocks away. And I left, and there's people following me. After they had sort of encircled the building and menacing us through the door and all that, and I tried to get them involved, some people followed me, and a car with the lights off follows me for like 3 blocks. And I thought, okay, this is it. It's going to happen. And I got my phone out and had 911 dialed and was ready to call and sort of bring the car, dive in the car, jump in and drive off, and they peeled out and drove off. I talked to the pastor who was in charge of one of the congregations that came out here over email over the next week or two. We had this exchange. And he said, oh, well, we were just providing security for your event to make sure that you got home safely. I thought, well, next time check with me first. And I spent about a week trying to convince him to let me come speak to his congregation. And I said, look, they don't get to hear about the other side of this. And you guys are all upset. You're all uptight about my having doubts about the resurrection. Let me come talk to your congregation. If it doesn't bother you at all. And he, no, I don't like that idea. Well, will you let me come speak to your class? And I said, absolutely. I will schedule you next week. You come up and come talk to my class. We have a lot of hard questions for you, but we do want to hear from you. And he didn't talk to me anymore after that. I didn't get any more response. So Manteca has been quite exciting in my speaking career in the recent past. All right, so let me talk about faith today. There's the book, as David already shared with you. I sold all the copies I have. I don't have any more copies on hand, but you can get it from Amazon. You get it from Amazon cheaper than you get it from me, so just buy it on Amazon if you're interested. According to the reviews, despite that multi-star review, it's just awful. And it'll be a waste of your time and your money. So get a copy to find out for yourself. Okay, so rather than talk about...
Is this your blog up again, please?
Sorry?
Put your blog up again.
It's proventhenegative.com.
No, it's something else.
It is, proventhenegative.com. I wrote it.
It's atheist.blog.
Provingthenegative.com.
I'll take that.
How's that? Okay? It's not good for me. I can wait from the amplifier. All right, so last talk was about the resurrection. I've got my doubts about it. There's a whole book about it. Tonight I want to talk about faith. I get lots of people, I study this stuff professionally. I publish on it. I think about it a lot. I have lots and lots of discussions and and exchanges with people about religious matters. And I frequently get people come up to me and say, well, what do you do about, what do you say about, what do you say when, what do you think about when somebody uses the F word? So this is my answer, my sort of protracted, detailed answer to that question tonight. I want to talk about what it means when people, what I think it means officially, technically, when people use the term. So I want to figure out what faith means as people typically use it, and then I want to talk about what I think is wrong, wrong-headed, confused, muddled about it. So maybe some non-religious examples. And I apologize for that font not being bigger. I'm always too verbose on my slides, so there's too much on there. But I have faith that my husband will come home safely from Afghanistan. I have faith in my wife. I have faith that the Detroit Lions will win the Super Bowl this year, which I understand is an outrageous proposition. That's important because you only have faith about things that are unlikely to be true, right? So who's the Super Bowl favorite? Or no, that's that question. So when something's plausible, when something's likely to be true, when you've got good compelling evidence that indicates that something's probably going to happen, nobody says faith in those circumstances. They only say it in cases where there's some doubt, some worry, some uncertainty. I have faith in the president despite his recent problems. She lied to me so many times before, it would take a huge leap of faith to believe her now. Loaning him the money to start his own business is an act of faith. Let's have faith that right makes might, and in the faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, to follow by faith alone is to follow blindly. Benjamin Franklin didn't think much of it. Or Martin Luther King, faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. All right, so those are some really, I take it, mainstream, really typical, really common, really ordinary uses of the word. Now, folks in this room may be more reluctant to ever use the word. I don't think you should be, but I think this is quite common, and I think this will let us triangulate a little bit and figure out what they're talking about. What do they mean? What are these people getting at when they say that sort of sentence? So, I think that people invoke faith when there's a shortcoming in the evidence, and believing is still the goal. So, you want to believe something, but the evidence is not getting you there. Either the evidence is ambiguous, the evidence is split, or the evidence is contrary overall. But overall, I mean, we can get really technical about this. There's mountains published on these things. But overall, the idea is that your total evidential picture is not at a P of 0.5 or greater. Like your total evidential picture doesn't indicate the truth of the conclusion to a degree greater than 50%. Because if it did, if I had a 70% likelihood that something's true, then that seems like it's reasonable I should believe it. If I have a 90% likelihood that something's true, it seems reasonable I should believe it. But if I've got a 20% likelihood that something's true, well, that's a case where the preponderance of evidence is against its being true. So to believe it in that case would be to believe something despite contrary evidence. So, just to be a bit technical, can't help my training, S believes P, where S is a person, and P is a proposition. By faith means S believes P despite inadequate evidence, where inadequate could be two things. On the whole, the evidence shows not P. That's like the 20% case I just described. Or on the whole, there isn't enough evidence to justify P. So maybe like an agnostic situation, an ambiguous situation. So I'm fixated on the prospect of aliens and intelligent extraterrestrial life. And there's all these physicists and cosmologists and experts, people who know all of these things, people at NASA, people who do exobiology. How cool is that for a job? And according to those people, as far as I can gather, when I listen to them all talk, there seem to be some considerations in favor of there being extraterrestrial life of some sort, and there's a bunch of considerations against, especially when the prospect of intelligent extraterrestrial life comes up. And I find myself, all things considered, to be in a agnostic situation about that conclusion. I'm not sure. I can't tell what the experts think. Got my own ideas, but it sounds like right now, given our evidential picture, don't believe, don't have enough to make it compelling, don't have enough to drive against it, don't have enough to say that it's false, but don't have enough to say that it's true. So I'm in the middle ground of suspending judgment. But faith cases are where you're either in a suspending judgment situation or you're in a negative situation and you go ahead and believe anyway, so you leap over. That's the leaping part that Martin Luther King is talking about. If there were enough evidence to justify P, then there'd be no need to invoke faith. Nobody brings that up in those kinds of cases. If you've got compelling evidence to think it's true, nobody says, oh, well, I have faith, right? I mean, the Lakers have won all the games in the, what do they do? How would you call that, a series? I'm not at all embarrassed to not know shit about professional sports. It doesn't bother me at all. How about, okay, maybe I can fake this one. In Major League Baseball, they have a World Series, and it comes down to 2 teams that play for a week, and they play, what, like 7 or 9 games or something. So there's a point at which it's an almost certain thing that if somebody's won X number of games, that's it, it's all over, right? So we're coming down to that last inning where some team, like the Giants, is about to cross that threshold, and they've won all the games, and all they got to do is get one more home run. Does anybody say in that circumstance, oh, well, I have faith that they'll win? You've got really good, pretty powerful evidence that indicates in favor of the claim. In that kind of case, we think that they will. But nothing hangs on that. I'll get some people mad at me about the sports case. So I'll just drop it. Nothing hangs on what I want to argue on those kinds of examples. All right, so just suffice it to say then that faith is belief without sufficient evidential justification. And I'm stating that relatively neutrally. I went through a period in my life where I was trying to be sympathetic, trying to understand it, trying to be sort of open to it. I'm not tonight. I'm just going to crap all over it tonight. But so far, I'm stating that neutrally, and I'm pretty open-minded about it. I think that's just a description of how people use the word and what they do when they're talking that way. When they use the F word, that seems to be what they're doing. They're believing in a certain fashion, and they're doing it without sufficient evidential justification as they see it. Okay, now I want to split out some different kinds more. As I do that, analytic philosophers love to make conceptual distinctions, so bear with me, I'm going to bore you to death. I think you'll like this. Okay, I don't have much truck with these people. There's people who have what I should call like a quiet, hopeful faith. Somebody says something like, well, I'm not sure about a lot of things, but I like to think that there's something after this, that things will be all right, but this isn't all there is. That's a kind of modest, pretty, as I see it, a pretty inoffensive kind of faith. Pretty common. Here's people piss me off. The evangelicals. And there's a particular different kind of character to this kind of faith. And I'm going to give you an example. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. But somebody says something like, you should believe, you shouldn't have doubts, you need Jesus in your heart, be strong in the Lord, resist the world, believe and find comfort. So there's a lot of admonitions here, there's recommendations, there's urging, there's pushing, there's this advocacy that you're not right in the mind with your belief structure, you need to alter it, it needs to be changed. So someone's prescribing to you that you think differently. And obviously the quiet, hopeful person's not like that. He or she is making just a modest claim about sort of their situation and what they think. But the evangelical, that's the guy who's pointing always with the goddamn fingers. Always pointing the fingers at you, right? They're always up in the pulpit and they're yelling at you and they're shouting and you need to do this and spitting and yelling. You've probably got issues from when I was a kid. So always with the fingers, right? Evangelical faith is prescriptive. And you know these folks because, well, I'll show you. There's should language, there's ought language, need, belief as a recommendation. You should. You're not currently this way, you should. Now notice that quiet, hopeful faith person, it's not like that. He or she wasn't urging you to believe likewise. But the evangelical, I mean, that's what evangelism means. To be an evangelist is to go out and push that on somebody else, to get them to believe. So now I'm talking about evangelical faith. So we're talking about someone who believes despite a ambiguous evidential picture, who believes despite contrary evidence perhaps, and they're pressing that you ought to believe. So you don't have something, but you should, you need to change, you need to get right with God, to feel better, to be reasonable, something, you need something, you need to fix something. The way you are isn't right, and you need to take steps to change. Now I'm not just offended by that by itself, because I think there's lots of cases where we do recommend, we urge, we press, we prescribe to other people that they believe things, and I'll show you those kinds of cases in a second. But these are the folks that are knocking at your door, they're trying to get in your head, so there's that. In fact, you can't see it, but this is from last year. She's got a big sign that says God is real. And that's from outside. I got a whole bunch of pictures. if you ever get an opportunity to do this, this is an unbelievable experience. Because I pulled up in my car last time, and there's all these people and all this yelling and all this shit going on out here. I'm like, wow, what's going on? And I was walking through it, and it's like, wow! And what's really interesting is I have the simultaneous feelings of, part of me was like, this is so cool, they're paying so much attention to me. And the other part of me is like, oh, they're gonna kill me. So I had kind of the horror and excitement about getting all the attention. It's a really weird combination. I highly recommend it. So there's some of them. And here's some more. I wish you could see my pictures. Bummer. Jesus saves, I repent, amen. It says I repent. I got some other pictures of guys recommending you need to repent. Because that's the point, after all, having a big sign walking around on the street. Evangelical faith, then, when we put these two things together, is this idea that you should believe. You should believe despite inadequate or contrary evidence. Okay, so now I think we're narrowing in on what the definition is, and now I got lots to say about that. Okay, so the good news. If you're discussing God with somebody and they drop the F-bomb, then congratulations, you just won the argument. That dude has just tapped out. That person has just given up. They've just said, oh, evidence, argument, reasoning? No, I'm not doing that. I believe by faith. Okay, we're done. Bye. We're done. There's nothing else to talk about. Because they've just said, there's no point to talking about this. There's no reasoning, there's no discussion, there's no reasoning, there's no argument to be had about it. And I'll explain why in more detail in a minute. This person, in effect, has said, I'm going to believe without regard to evidence. And those are some crazy dudes from a Japanese sitcom. In effect, this person has said, no rules apply to what I believe other than I want to believe this. Right? Because they've said, I'm going to believe despite contrary evidence. I'm going to believe despite inadequate evidence. Okay, so this field's wide open then, right? Because there's resounding, powerful, overwhelming evidence against all kinds of things out there, and there's ambiguous evidential situations about things out there. For us to just go ahead and believe anyway, despite those sorts of circumstances, means there's no rules. Right? Oh, I thought we were playing soccer. When you kick it out past this line. In soccer, it's out, it's off field, it's out of bounds. We have a rule for that. Here's what we do. Here's how you play soccer. Here's how you reason. Here's how you use logic. Here's how you make inferences. Oh, no. I'm not doing that. I'm just going to believe. If it's not legitimate, if I can't earn it using reason and evidence, then I'm just going to steal it. I'm just going to take it. I don't have an argument for this. I don't have reasons for this. I'm just going to grab it. I'm going to take this belief and well, I don't need to offer, I'm refusing to offer evidential justification for what I want to say. I'm quitting rationality because it isn't giving me what I want. Rationality isn't providing you with justification for the conclusion, so I'm done with that. I'm leaving that. That, in effect, is what someone's doing when they say, oh, well, I believe by faith. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that faith is a virtue in mainstream popular American culture. We have been subjected to thousands and thousands of examples in media, in movies, in TV shows, in all sorts of circumstances where somebody is in a situation where the evidence doesn't look good, but they believed anyway. And who's that? That's the hero. That's Bruce Willis, who's going to win the day because he's going to press on even though all the signs are against him. We've got 1,000 examples like that in our lives where this is held up as a good thing, it's a virtuous thing, it's a powerful thing, it's a positive thing. You should do this. You need to cultivate more of this in your life. And what I'm trying to do is turn that on its head and pull out, expose that really for what it is. What we're saying there when we do that is, when the evidence is going against you, just disregard it. Move on. Believe anyway. It doesn't matter. You should have force of character and believe. You should persevere no matter what. And that's held up, oftentimes, that's held up much higher and much more esteem as a virtue than someone who's thoughtful, careful, cautious, slow, deliberate, and says, well, I think all the evidence indicates this, so I'm inclined to believe this, although I'm prepared to change my mind. People hate that when scientists, when scientific experts, when witnesses, when experts on the stand or experts who get on a TV show, somebody who really knows what they're doing, somebody who is from, you know, some academic department somewhere who goes, well, there's mixed evidence about that. We're not entirely clear about this. We think this is true, but it might not be. Well, that's not soundbiteable. That's not useful on the news. That's certainly not useful on Fox when you're having talking heads all arguing with each other about stuff. You can't have somebody who's mealy-mouthed and slow and careful and thoughtful and deliberate like that. You've got to have somebody who believes and presses and believes no matter what and presses on no matter what. So I want to just expose that and pull it out and put it in a negative light, because we've had enough of it being exposed in such a positive light, or being put in such a positive light. I will not subject my views, as this person says, to the rigors of the rules of coherence, consistency, logical truth, induction, or implication. The person who says, oh, I believe by faith, he's just said, oh, I'm not doing it that way. That's not how I got this belief. He's left the rationality playing field. And that's why we're done, in effect. I mean, you're talking to him, you can move. You say, oh, now I understand. Now we're in a different position. I thought we were talking about whether or not there's evidence for design. I thought we were talking about whether or not evolution is true given the evidence. I didn't know we were talking about you believing something by faith, because that's a different story altogether. Are we talking about the evidence and whether or not something's reasonable? Or are we talking about the general reasonableness or the general policy of believing things by faith? We can switch topics and we can go to that. We can now talk about whether or not it's ever, or whether it's, in this circumstance, it's permissible or okay to believe on faith, but that's a different thing. That person has just gone from playing one game to moving over to another game, but in this new game, there are no rules. It's like that little kid that you used to play with when you were a kid, and you all were like playing kickball, and it was his ball, and then when he didn't do well, or he got kicked out or whatever, or he got put out on the kickball team, he would get his ball and say, I'm taking my ball and going home. The one who just quit, who just said, I'm not going to participate unless I'm winning. That's what the F word amounts to. You're saying, oh, I'm not going to have this discussion unless I'm winning, and you know what? I will do anything to win. I will abandon everything else in order to win. I will hold on to this no matter what anybody says, no matter what evidence comes up. This is an indefeasible belief, which I take to be the consummate hallmark of irrationality and dogmatism. Now, it doesn't always come out that way, because we treat faith as a virtue and we think of it as positively, but in effect, that's what they're doing when they move to that kind of approach. Okay, in effect, they said, I don't care your underwear. Okay, so just had to slip that in. So I'm going to partition questions and answers to the end. So hold on to it and I'll come back, just so I can jam through and get all this stuff out and then we'll talk about it. So, I don't want to suggest that I'm arguing that we ought not be prescriptive. I think we ought to be prescriptive about certain things. I think reason is prescriptive. So don't get me wrong, I'm not just complaining about the fact that believers are urging you to believe, or there's nothing about that I find offensive. Because I think reason is prescriptive. Normally when there's evidence or sound argument or ample justification, in those kinds of cases, that imposes what we call an epistemic obligation on us to believe. And I can explain that, but I'll just give you an example. If a jury member is confronted with overwhelming evidence for the guilt of the defendant, our hope and our expectation, our demand and their obligation is to convict. So if you get put on a jury, the judge is going to lay out the rules for you and say, look, your job is to determine whether or not the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They're going to sketch out what a reasonable doubt amounts to. You're going to say, here's the standard of evidence, here's the evidence you've been given, and you need to decide. And in that kind of case, obviously, nobody goes, oh, well, I know the evidence is for this guy's innocence, but I have faith he's guilty, so I'm just going to believe anyway. We don't allow faith in those kinds of cases. We do demand, though, that reason, that evidence, that being thoughtful and reasonable is an obligation. And not just a moral obligation, but there's an epistemic obligation here. By that I mean about knowledge. That we all hold each other to the standard, that when you're talking to somebody, you have expectations about their holding themselves to certain standards of rigorous thought and rationality. I mean, maybe they fail to meet those often, but you do expect that they will see the implication of things that are true, and you have an expectation that they will believe them when their evidence indicates in their favor. So reason, is quite comfortably, quite normally, is prescriptive. To fail to answer the demands of reason, is to be irrational, it's to be wrong, it's to be mistaken, it's to fail in your duty. It's to fail, and I'll tease out some different ways it's your duty to do so. But faith can't be prescriptive, is partly what I've been trying to get at here. There's no obligation to have faith. And that's why the game suddenly changes when somebody says, oh, well, it seems to me that evolution can't explain the existence of life on Earth, it can't explain all the things, the diversity of life, it can't explain all the complexity of the human body or whatever. So somebody starts off sounding like they're making an argument. They're going to say, oh, well, this story can't fully rationally account for this conclusion, and here's my objections with it. And you pursue that discussion, or you have a discussion about God, and it seems to be talking about the evidence and the arguments in favor, and then somebody says, oh, but really, at the end of the day, I believe by faith. Now we've shifted. Now we've changed the story, and now we're no longer in a situation where one person can recommend to the other that they ought to believe on that basis. As long as we were talking about evidence, now I've got leverage on you because you're obligated to be a rational citizen of a society with me. You've got an obligation to listen to the evidence and draw the right conclusion, and I've got an obligation as a rational agent in society with you to listen to the evidence and draw the right conclusion. But now, as it turns out, somebody's believing on faith. Now we just changed that. The dynamic has suddenly changed. There's no more prescription available. Wow, that's small. I'll read it to you. How could it make any sense for evangelical Smith to urge, recommend, or demand believing by faith to skeptical Jones? Okay, Smith and Jones are arguing. Smith is an evangelical, Jones is skeptical, and evangelical Smith wants to recommend to Jones, oh, well, you ought to believe. I have faith, you ought to believe. You hear it? I got faith, you ought to believe. You need to change your thought structure. That's incoherent. That's complete bullshit. It doesn't make any sense at all. I've got faith, you should do likewise. What? No sense at all. Does skeptical Jones have a duty to believe? If Jones doesn't, is she being irrational? If Jones says, no, I'm not going to have faith, is she failing in her duty somehow to listen to the evidence? No. Smith has said exactly what Smith is doing. Smith has said, I'm believing despite the evidence. So it doesn't make any sense for Jones to be on the hook to believe it. What's the basis for demanding that skeptical Jones disregard the evidence and believe something that isn't justified? I can't see what that could possibly be. You should have faith isn't a reason for Jones to believe anymore, then there isn't enough evidence to justify it is a reason for Jones to believe. I have faith is not a reason to believe it. That's an admonition that there aren't enough reasons to believe it. That's an acknowledgement that this is not a reasonable conclusion. So it can't be recommended or urged on somebody else to do likewise. It's the consummate rational policy to only accept well-justified conclusions and to suspend judgment about the rest. Now, the way Spock always said this, I should be getting in there, I'm really sad about Leonard Nimoy, but Spock would always talk about being logical. And they, I won't give him much heat for this, but the confusion here was that Spock always confused logical with being reasonable or being rational. What he meant, it didn't sound as good, but what he meant was, well, the rational conclusion is to draw this conclusion. So Spock is our consummate example of somebody who does follow one of those policies. Now maybe that's the bad thing, everybody's like, oh, you want to be like Spock. Well, actually, but anyway. Faith is a suspicious policy, and here's St. Augustine admitting it. Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of this faith is to see what you believe. Now notice when you put it in this context, with me all ranting and carrying on and teasing out all the problems with it, you look at it and go, oh wow, it doesn't sound so awesome anymore. It doesn't sound so charming and sweet and like, oh, what a nice virtue. No, it sounds crazy. Right? You're just going to believe, and then after you believe, it'll make sense to you? What? Can't beat up on Augustine. Well, I came in this room and beat up on Jesus, so I can sure beat up on Augustine. So more examples. Failing to believe what is clearly supported by the evidence is ordinarily irrational. He didn't have enough votes to win the election. Nevertheless, I have faith that he's the president. Your blood test came back negative, says the doctor, but I have faith that you have cancer. All the evidence suggests that your engine block is cracked, but I have faith that it isn't. My grades for the class add up to 53%, but I have faith that I passed. Sorry. Doesn't work. Jose Canseco's lab results show steroids, but I have faith that he's clean. Now this is actually quite a common kind of thing. That's actually, I'm not even making, the others are outrageous, right? You laugh at the others, but people say stuff like that, right? I kind of said it about Lance Armstrong. I didn't want to believe about Lance Armstrong for the longest time, and then I felt really betrayed. And I used to think to myself, do I have faith in Lance Armstrong? No, I just think it's reasonable to believe. Until he got fully exposed. And then I'm like, oh, okay, I don't believe anymore. I moved over from believing to agnostic to disbelief. Which is good, you should do that. I realize that those are photos of my wife with another man, but I have faith that she's not cheating on me. Well, what? If somebody did that, you would just think he was being crazy. Or maybe you think they're hot. I don't know. Failure to have faith is not similarly culpable. Okay, that's too many negatives, but think that through for a second. Failure to have faith is not similarly culpable. Okay, culpable means blameworthy here. So for somebody to not have faith is not something they'd be at fault for. Now, if you are in possession of compelling evidence in favor of some conclusion and you don't accept it, you're culpable. You're not believing, you're failing to believe something that you should believe given the evidence. But for you to fail to make the leap beyond and to defy evidence is not culpable. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing blameworthy about doing that. Okay. At the very least, having faith is a questionable practice, not failing to have it. So Smith can't offer faith to Jones as grounds for rational belief. Okay. Now, why does the skeptic care about all of this? Well, look, here's why I think we should care. Because, especially with my example of somebody who has the softer, more modest, quiet, hopeful faith, it seems like, you don't want to go be beaten up by your grandma. She's got that kind of faith. It feels like it's sort of, shooting fish in a barrel or something. It just feels mean to sort of rob somebody of that, especially given how favorable and how sort of positive we portray that kind of believing. But look, allowing this sort of policy, allowing this sort of habit or this sort of principle gets us into trouble. Because what happens is that believers seize belief illegitimately, I've been arguing, by faith. Then the ideology that the faith is, that is built on that faith leads to doing what? Well, they put people on school boards. They decide which textbooks they want kids to have in the schools. They decide who should be president, which bond measure should pass, whether gay marriage should be legal, whether there's global warming, what sort of abortion law should we have, stem cell research, health care, social policies, who we should go to war with, who we should have peace with, who we should kill, who should let live, who we should boycott, whether they believe basic science, and whether they think evolution happened. Okay, so they make the dirty trick at the start. Oh, I'm not going to believe on the basis of evidence. I'm going to believe by faith. And then now we're in the door, and now you get all that stuff. So now it's not like, and we've got this custom, we've got this treatment, this attitude. There's a thread in American culture where your religious belief is your personal business. I respect that. I can't come after you, attack that. It's your own private matter between you and God, or no God, or whatever. And people are sensitive, right? It's awkward to just like start picking a fight over this or going after somebody for their beliefs. But look, those beliefs feed into all this stuff. And those people live with us. They're your neighbors. They're your family. There are people in your community. And those beliefs that are gotten this way then contribute to all of those kinds of social policies that don't just bear on them. They bear on their kids and you and everybody else in culture. I got lots of examples. So these folks are not going to get the Good Citizen Award. A few examples. Oh, this one makes me mad. Fucking Jim Shimkus. Okay, Republican, of course he's a Republican. Illinois. He's now back to the chair because the Republicans have taken over the House. He's the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He's a global warming denier. You know why? He insists that global warming isn't happening because after Noah's flood in Genesis, God promised he would never allow widespread flooding to happen again. That's why Shimkus thinks global warming is not happening. Okay, next. Joe Barton, Texas. This is the good part. Wind is a finite resource, and harnessing it would slow the winds down, which would cause the temperature to go up. So Barton is opposed to developing clean energy. You know what else? Why does he think so? Barton thinks that wind is God's method for cooling the planet, so we shouldn't put clean energy windmills up because they will slow the wind down. There's so many layers of stupid here, I can't even find them all. Right? And I presume it's based on faith. I don't know, maybe Barton's got some deadly argument in favor of thinking that God's real, but there you go. More. 42% of Americans are straight up young earth creationists. They're, let's see, the numbers here are, God created humans in their present form. So this pale white, the pale green line here from 1982 up to the present has hovered around 40+%. Goes up and down, takes up and down a little bit, but mostly stays the same. 4 in 10 Americans are young earth creationists. Now, I don't have numbers or data to connect those folks with the faith folks, but I'm willing to venture that out of the 120 or 130 million people, a good chunk of those people will also ultimately, if pressed, say, oh, why do I believe that? I believe on faith. Wait, you believe that on faith. So you're acknowledging that you don't have evidence for it, you just believe that, right? So that's dangerous to the rest of us for a lot of reasons here, and this one's really bad. You see that? Jesus Christ will kill every homosexual at Armageddon on a church marquee. How do you know this? Oh, I know it by faith. Right? Having faith matters. It bears on the rest of your belief structure. It's a policy that you've adopted. It's something you're letting something slide here. You're letting something come in. And it matters when all of these other people's livelihood, health, well-being, the laws, the culture, society depends on your participation in culture. And you believe stuff like that. And how'd you get started there? By faith. Okay, so faith robs us of the truth. We only get to recommend or prescribe belief because we think it's true, and we only get to claim that it's true if the evidence justifies concluding that it's true. Faith is believing without justification. You can believe by faith, or you can use evidence to prescribe belief, but you can't prescribe faith. Okay, now more. Here's another problem. Now this is not going to have much leverage on the faithful believer, because they've already said, I'm off the rationality playing field. But I just want to point out a dilemma, a paradox that they put themselves into. Maybe to the believer it seems like faith is a way to get across the great divide between the worlds. The evidence isn't compelling, but maybe faith gives you a special kind of knowledge. So maybe by being down here in the natural world, faith can get me to, connect me to God. And you'll hear people talk much more favorably about this than I will. You'll hear people talk about this as if, well, it's a special kind of knowing, a special kind of awareness of God. And they'll say no. They don't really understand what no means in that case, I think. But they feel like, well, this is another way to get to ultimate reality, to the truth. Okay, so again, reason and evidence. Reason is the set of cognitive capacities that make it possible for us to seek out evidence, to sift through it, and to draw conclusions. Reasons are only tool for separating reality from fantasy, fact from fiction, justified belief from nonsense. So here's the dilemma, here's the problem we get into. Once we abandon reason and evidence, there are no principled, coherent, or non-prejudicial grounds on which to prefer one God over another. And you've thought about this, but I'm going to try to make it really graphic. How many supernatural hypotheses are out there vying for your consideration? How many gods are there for your faith? Is the only game in town from the church you grew up in? Okay, so this guy is wondering, I should have faith in God, right? How many gods are there vying for my faith? Well, there's a lot. There's 50. There are some 5, 6, 7,000 gods, deities, demigods, important, mythical, supernatural characters in human history. So which one should I believe in? Montu, Manava, Rudrana, Orcus, Ryan Gombe? Well, okay, those all seem outrageous. Flying spaghetti monsters up there too. Those all seem outrageous. I never heard of all of those. Okay, but what does your hearing about it have to do with it? If you're wondering about where to direct your faith, if you're saying that reason and evidence doesn't matter, I'm just going to believe, well then, how do you discriminate between all these other possible supernatural hypotheses? Okay, so the problem here is that you're now overloaded. On what basis will you decide to opt for one and not the others? If it's okay to abandon reason and just believe without justification, then why not Baal, Akshtupa, Ryan Gombe, Pugu, Pen and Win, Orcus, Oranmila, Ninzunaga, Ningarama, Montu, and so on and so forth? Why not all of those? Oh, I've never heard of all those. Well, what does that have to do with it? If you're saying reason doesn't matter, it's okay, or put it this way. Suppose now I get a bunch of people who believe by faith. I get 10 different people who believe by faith, but they all believe in each one of those different ones. So I got a Baal guy, I got an Orcus guy, I got an Oramilla guy, a Ryan Gombe guy, and they go, oh, I believe by faith. Okay, y'all got to sort that out. Right, I don't know how to sort that out. I was actually on a big panel. I was sort of the token idiot atheist. Whole big panel of us is Unitarian, and a Jew, and a Jehovah's Witness, and a Muslim. And actually, you'd think that I'd have the most trouble with anybody on the table. The Jehovah's Witness and the Muslim, those two were like, oh, they were really having trouble down there. It was a big audience, and we all got asked questions. And they were both sort of fundamentalists of their flavors. And the Muslim would go digging through his Quran, and the Jehovah's Witnesses go digging through his Bible, and they'd have this little like battle of the books, battle of the magic books. And I was like, wow, you guys hear each other doing that? That's crazy. You're just like reading your books to each other. Should we maybe ask whether or not it's reasonable to believe either one of those books? So anyway, if you get, you see the dilemma, the paradox. If we get these 10 different people who all believe by faith, but they believe in all these different characters, why would I think any one of those was reasonable? Certainly they can't recommend to me to do likewise. And it's clear that how lawless this whole thing has become. Well, I prefer this one, I prefer this one. Oh, well, I prefer broccoli. I prefer, chocolate ice cream. I mean, what does your preference have to do with it, right? You need some principled way in which to discriminate between these, because the world is full of hypotheses that are competing for your belief space. They want to get in your head. There's lots of ideas out there that want to get in your head. Acupuncture, chiropractic, astrology, all this stuff trying to get in there, right? And you need some kind of capacity to discriminate and decide which ones are viable, which ones are not. Faith in one is just as good as faith in another, right? Are you going to argue that one of these ideas is more reasonable than the others? And this is particularly annoying, right? When somebody says, oh, I believe by faith, furthermore, I think mine's more reasonable than those others. You don't get to do that. You don't get to change the rules of the game in order to adjust and just make sure you get to have your conclusion and then jump back in the game while you're winning. Right? You don't just change the game to make sure that you win all the time and then somebody looks like they're coming out ahead or making a better argument, and you say, oh, well, I believe by faith. I'm still winning. I win no matter what. Okay, so this guy's got a faith dilemma. How can he opt or choose between all of these different hypotheses? And you can't see all the arrows, but I'm arguing that he's got a sort of paradox here, that once we give up reason, evidence, justification, then the floodgates are wide open, and there's no way for him to make any discriminations. Now, maybe someone like this doesn't care, ultimately, but I think they should. I think they should for all the same reasons that we care about other things. Okay, so just to make my point a bit more graphic, and I'll stop. Suppose, just to illustrate how crazy this is, suppose the atheist pulls the same move. So the atheist says, I know that there are no gods whatsoever. And the believer says, but how can you ever know something like that for sure? Oh, well, I have faith that there's no gods. Right? Nada. Nothing up there. How do you know that? Oh, I got faith. That doesn't make sense. How can you have faith in something that isn't real? You can only have faith that there's a God. Well, who made that rule? I don't have to be concerned with what makes sense. I'm off in faith land now. And in faith land, we reject reason, evidence, and good sense so that we can help ourselves to any conclusion we want without any worries about being coherent or making sense. That was what I was telling you. I believe by faith. My faith in the vast godlessness of the universe is beyond human comprehension. It transcends our puny understanding. And that's why you don't understand. But if you just come with me, if you just make the leap of faith, you could join me and it would make perfect sense to you. And I have some literature here for you to read. Believer, but doesn't it bother you to just go off the rails like that? Actually, I find it all surprisingly comforting. As soon as I let faith into my heart, all my worries and rational needs about figuring out the truth and being reasonable dissolve. Faith brings great peace of mind, and now I've realized that I can believe anything I like without any responsibility for justifying it. In fact, I'm going to get a tattoo. Live by faith, not by sight. Thought that was a particularly bad tattoo. I like how swollen it up is in action. But that's insane! What about your responsibilities as a citizen and a moral agent in society with the rest of us? How can you think that the evidence is irrelevant to what you believe, or that you can just dismiss the importance of rationality? Wow, this is a strange turn of events. The atheist, you know I don't like your tone. You're angry and intolerant of my faith. I'm exercising my religious freedom, and you have to respect that and my right to believe what I want. You're discriminating against my faith. You're persecuting me. Okay, in conclusion, faith is justificationless believing. Faith is not prescriptive. It's a game with no rules. Faith is dangerous, I've argued. Faith makes bad citizens. Yet you've got the floodgate problem. Atheist faith is absurd. Amen. My water, and then my water back there. Yeah, and then let's ask questions. I have a question.
All right, so I've got a microphone. Who's got questions? All right. There you go.
So I think when you were doing the argument between the atheist and the Christian, I think a lot of us have an experience where when we actually get accused of using faith, we get accused of, it takes just as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, and that's one that I didn't see addressed. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's obviously not a good argument because you're just bludgeoning us with the idea that you're just like me. But I didn't know if you had a thought on that or a response to that.
It's really interesting. I can't say I've ever heard someone actually sort of flesh it out and make it. I've heard the same thing you've heard many times, but I've never heard someone sort of flesh it out and make sense of it. But my off-the-cuff idea, my response is that look, there's an asymmetry between believing and lacking belief or not disbelieving. That in general, our default situation with regard to things that might be true is you don't believe them until a certain threshold of proof has been met. But until then, you either, I think the reasonable thing to do is either suspend judgment about it in some circumstances or to disbelieve it. And I can rattle off lots of hypotheses that you disbelieve. The moon is made of cheese, right? There's this wall is made of yogurt behind the corkboard. There's a giant container holding yogurt behind this wall. Okay, now you don't have much information about that. You haven't checked it. But I suspect you all disbelieve it. And nobody's going to go, oh, well, it takes faith to disbelieve it. No, I think you've got a lot of information, or at least your default presumption ought to be, well, these things are false, or maybe I'll be agnostic about some of them until I get evidence in their favor. So I don't think that the atheist has to make a leap of faith here. Now, I do think, though, to grant credit where credit's due, the fact that so many people have believed, so many smart people have believed, that belief is by far the overwhelming majority of humans on the planet now, and human history, people believe that belief has been the sort of standard default for so much of human history. That's a big deal, and I don't think that's something that the atheist, agnostic, or disbeliever ought to take lightly. I mean, you all got to have a story about that. You got to have a good story about that. Because what you're saying is, oh no, they're all wrong and you all got it right. Because that's billions and billions and billions of people on the planet who've got a radically different view about reality than you do, and you are, what, you think they're all crazy? I mean, I kind of suggested that, but I think that ought to count for something, and we owe it to ourselves to think through long and hard. Well, if it's true that there's no God, then what the hell? What's going on with all of that? There's got to be a good, interesting story on that. But I'm not sure what the actual leap of faith would be in this other case, because our default is to not believe. I hope that helps. Yeah.
I think I have a minor problem with how we define faith as it speaks to intentionality, because you don't find believers saying they're intentionally abandoning logic. They have taken as axiomatic, as a founding, as a start of their reasoning, that this belief is true. Whether or not they have good justification for it, they believe they have good justification for it, so they don't believe that they have left logic behind. They are intentionally following a presupposition. They are intentionally following things that they have taken on good advice from people around them. Obviously, culture accepts it. They believe, whether or not they have justification, that they are rational and they have not abandoned logic. So just as it speaks to the intention of the believer, and this is why discussions with them are so difficult. So
I hear you.
The definition of faith there kind of bothers me.
Well, I think what you're complaining about is, would the person who is invoking faith readily agree that that's what they're doing? And I think you're probably right. In lots of circumstances, the person who says by their own admission, I believe in my faith, is not going to say, I'm leaving the playing field of rationality. Right? I'm caricaturing that view. But I'm arguing that in fact, that's what you're doing. So I'm exaggerating to make the point, and I wouldn't be at all surprised that it's difficult. I'm not surprised to hear that it's difficult to get somebody to admit I'm being starkly irrational, or I'm believing in contradiction. People won't do that. It never feels like they're doing that, even when you're doing it, which you do it. You believe contradictory things. You've got all kinds of paradoxical or puzzling or irrational pairs of ideas and structures in your head. But it doesn't feel that way to you. It never feels that way. We're not wired up. That's sort of like the forbidden conclusion. That's like something, you know, when it happens is you're in an argument with your spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, husband or wife, and you say something and then they call you out on it. You go, oh, I just want this. And she says, oh, but you wanted that. And you're like, wait, how can I have both of those? Right? And you try to tell a story, an account whereby, and this might just be a cover your ass measure. It might be true, or you might be just covering your ass because you've been caught out. But you try to find a story whereby it's possible to have both of those claims, and they can make sense cohere in the same system. Because I think the acknowledgement or facing up to the fact that we are believing something contradictory or irrational is a very, very difficult thing for us to accept. Some of the research on this, they'll talk about a cognitive shear pin. There's some conclusions we just can't accept. And what happens is a shear pin is a little weak piece of metal that breaks between the hole of the trailer onto the truck. And it breaks, rather than have the whole thing get smashed to pieces, it breaks and they separate, and we blow a fuse. So I'm not at all surprised, and I think you're right, that people won't readily accept this conclusion. But in fact, I'm arguing that when we believe by faith, what we're doing is we're abandoning the evidence. And what people are doing, what I'm trying to bring out here, is that oftentimes people will switch back and forth. They change the rules of the game back and forth. Oh, I believe by faith. Oh, but here's some reasons. Oh, but I believe by faith. Oh, but here's some reasons. And they'll keep wanting to go on as if we're giving a reasoned argument, but then pulling that trump card or that little dirty trick, they don't think it's a dirty trick, to backfill the story when it starts to break down. And that's changing the game. That's altering the rules of the game so that you always win. And it's a dirty trick if we're playing it. Which game are we playing? So that's, I mean, if I'm offering any sort of go-to advice, like, we all need to be calling that out. Okay, so what are we doing here? Are we talking about whether or not it's more reasonable to think God exists based on the evidence, or that the evolution happened based on the evidence, or are we talking about faith? They're separate matters. And I know that sometimes with some of the more thoughtful apologists and some of the more sophisticated reasoners, you'll hear them trying to, William Lane Craig's in a famous book, Reasonable Faith. Sorry, I just blew a fuse. What? Reasonable faith doesn't make any sense. Well, you spend like 300 pages, convoluted gymnastics, trying to make that all work together, and it won't work because of the reason I just laid out. Okay, sorry. Lost my mind for a moment. Troy?
Yeah, I can think of two different ways you could go after someone who's called maybe the faith card. One is you can catch the fact claim that they actually want to believe that. Or there's a second way, if there's different degrees of crazy, you can ask them about what they believe about God, so you can see whether we can do business in some other way, or if you're just completely out of your mind.
Well, one of the ways I put this in the book, it's very good input, very good insight here. It's your mail. Is I came up with something I call the feasibility test. I'll get these emails periodically. Somebody finds all my stuff online, reads my blog, all mad, sends me this, entertaining email, and they want to go, 5 rounds, and they want to fight. And I'll say, well, maybe here's the feasibility test. First, you got to see the past test before I even want to take time to talk to you. Are you prepared, under any circumstances, hypothetical or otherwise, to possibly change your mind? Would you, under some wild scenario, maybe it's not the real scenario, but is it possible that you might revise your belief in the light of some new information, new ideas, some argument, in any form, any shape or manner? And if the answer is, well, no, I believe by faith, I believe no matter what, it's okay, I got other things to do. I delete. That's why God made the delete key. I got other things to do. Because that person just signaled that they want to fight, and they're going to, really what you're doing there is a really complicated exercise in sort of rhetoric and rationalizing. It's apologetics. And if somebody tells you they're doing apologetics, that's what they're signaling. They're saying, and you mentioned some presuppositional kind of talk here. This is someone who has said, okay, I got this idea, and I'm putting that at the center, and I'm going to build everything around it, and that thing is inviolate. That thing is not subject to alteration. I'm going to, by hook or by crook, I'm going to construct a story around this no matter what. And that's what apologetics amounts to. And if somebody's doing that, there's not really, the weird thing is that it seems like you're having an argument with them. It seems like you're having a reasonable conversation with them. Like you're offering reasons and objections, you go back and forth arguments. And it seems like you're having a coherent, rational conversation. But in fact, the way they've rigged the game, their only function, their only purpose is to defend that conclusion, come hell or high water. Defend, actually, that axiom. They've adopted that as an axiomatic foundation, and they've said, I'm going to build everything else up on this, but that thing can't be changed. So if you get past the feasibility test, I got other things to do with my time. Somebody asked me to debate, one of his students asked me to debate William Lane Craig after my book came out, and I was scared to death. I said, no way. Because Craig got so much experience debating. But my other reason for not doing it was this reason. Because Craig is quite open about this. This is a indefeasible proposition. I will not relent on this conclusion under any circumstances whatsoever. So debating, arguing, discussing is a sort of fruitless waste of time in this kind of case.
All right, go ahead.
I've got 2, possibly 3 questions. First of all, I'm questioning your use of the word faith, because we often say things like, I have faith that my car's going to start, which basically, in that sense, we're using it as a probability statement that when I go out.
Give me a case where you'd say that.
About a week ago, I had problems with starting my car.
You had problems. You had counter evidence.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's right. You had problems. You had counter evidence.
I had counter evidence,
Yeah.
correct.
You would have reasons
I
to
had
doubt that your
counter
car was
evidence,
wrong.
okay, and I went in and I got a new little battery. So I drive a Prius, so I have a little battery that goes inside the electric key that starts the car.
Yeah.
And somebody was asking me, are you going to be able to get to my house? And I didn't say this, but I could have said,
I got faith.
I've got faith in
Yeah.
it. In that case, we're just making a probability statement. What I'm saying is I think a lot of people that use the word faith think that they're not sure about it, but they think the evidence is more than likely in favor of the belief that they have. And so I think, you made that one statement. We only say use the word faith when we have less than just less than a justified belief. I think that's not quite true. I think a lot of times we do use the word faith when we're not certain but we're hopeful. So it's almost a substitute for the word hope.
I actually agree. I think we agree about a whole bunch of stuff here, and I think that's right. Now, when I was being careful about this, I don't think much hinges on this. I don't think it'll Ultimately, I don't think there's a real disagreement here of any substance. That the reason that faith might have felt comfortable or normal or ordinary to say in the case you were describing is because you were calling to mind some reasons to doubt. In the cases where your car's working fine, you've got no reasons to have any worries about it, you're less inclined to use faith. Now, I've got a nice tight kind of restrictive definition where I've said inadequate amounts to, on the whole, the evidence shows not P, or on the whole, there isn't enough evidence to justify P. Now, we can leave open the question of what justified means here. Now, I can get more precise about it. I think there's a reasonable range within which that people suspend judgment. So, given the probabilities from 0 to 1, 50-50 in the middle, 0.5 in the middle, and suppose your evidence is ranging from 0.4 to 0.6. Those are cases where I often suspend judgment. And then as my evidence seems to, and we're not perfect probability machines, but roughly speaking, as my evidence moves north of that suspended judgment range and starts creeping up into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and getting more and more likely, it seems to me that I have more and more justification for believing it's true. And it approaches certainty when I get to 1. Now, sometimes people talk as if we're never justified unless we have absolute certainty. I think that's a mistake. I don't think you actually do that in your life. But sometimes when we're having philosophical conversations, people will arbitrarily raise that threshold. Oh, well, you can't know that. You don't really know that. But when the judge sits down with the jury in court of law and says beyond a reasonable doubt, the judge doesn't demand of you that you have absolute certainty. We don't have absolute certainty about much of anything. Maybe some math problems, right? Some a priori deductive math problems, we get absolute certainty about those. But with the vast majority of ordinary empirical beliefs we have what amounts to probability evidence in their favor. And so I think what happens, to your point, that many times when people are bringing doubts to mind, now maybe their total evidential situation is not actually on the downhill side, but when they're bringing doubts to mind and they're worried about it, because we don't really proportionally evaluate risk and probability very well, they say, oh, well, I didn't think about that. Well, I have faith. When we're worrying, when we have doubts, we invoke faith. I think we're more likely to do it in those cases.
What about bets? Or we're betting on a team, or we're in competition ourselves, and I have faith that I'll win the game. I mean, those kind of things, you know, it's kind of...
I've got that's one of my examples on the previous slide. So what's your question about it?
Well, my question is, we're using the word faith where we think that we're not sure we're going to win the game, but we have
You're hoping.
We're hoping, and
Absolutely.
we actually, the way we sussed it out, we figured out, and this way most athletes think they're going to win. Whether they win or not, they've convinced themselves that they're going to win, or they wouldn't even be engaged in the competition. And I'm just saying, I think that's another example of where we use the term faith to express a belief that something is true when we don't have certainty.
I think that's consistent with what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm totally.
And I got a follow-up question later on Paul Tilley, but somebody else has a question.
Okay. Yeah, that's. Go ahead. But let's spread it out. There's some other people that haven't asked you.
I was having a bit of a cognitive issue with whether or not...
Crisis of faith, I hope.
Well, no, cognitive issue.
I think your microphone is on.
Oh,
You're loud enough.
I can talk. Here, I'll give you the mic. I was kind of having a cognitive issue, and it kind of led me to a little bit of wordplay. Is that the assumption throughout your discussion is whether or not the people who are engaging are actually acting in good faith. The two politicians you brought up, it was rather clear to me that there was some subterfuge with it. And one of the other things I noted in your discussion is when you started evoking certainty, and in the scientific realm, one of the things you did not point out is the intense skepticism that's put towards climate scientists who say there is definitely a certainty for global warming. And that's completely different from, that's one of the cases where you've got scientific certainty being expressed, But still, there's intense skepticism and it's being treated as if it's fake.
I'm not sure I follow. One question is, explain that to me again. What's the question? What's it got to do with me?
Well, I think the first thing is that the examples used with the politicians are kind of short circuit your argument a little bit, because it kind of...
I'm not wedded to those. I could give you 1,000 examples
I'm
of
sure-
case where
I'm
somebody
sure.
invokes faith and then they do something stupid.
Yeah, but...
I don't need Chimkus, although I think he's genuinely stupid. But
No, I agree. Most people from wild states generally are interested. But the thing is that the idea that people are sitting there taking faith as a higher value, but all of a sudden using it as a negative value when scientists basically is engaged in certainty.
I still don't understand that at all. You think
You are
scientists
seen,
are
you are
claiming
seen as a
certainty?
good person if you have faith in religion. You are seen as a bad person if you are
you're
placing faith in science.
The behavior...
It's a different use of the
What?
word
No,
faith.
sorry, you're saying something entirely
Right,
different.
it's,
As I understand.
it goes into intentionality. One has.
Well, that was your question. I'm sorry.
Right, but I think-
Well, the thing is that my first point feeds into the second one, is that if you're assuming good faith, there's no reason for anyone to question scientists saying there is almost absolute certainty that we are going to experience negative consequences from global warming. That can be perceived as an act of faith because you're not sitting there hedging, going back and forth, which is what your example was, saying, well, there's some evidence in support, some against, but the perception that it's...
I'm not sure if I can help here. Here's one of the things that happens in science that's different than what happens with individual epistemic agents. That in science, when we propose a hypothesis within like a lab or a person or a team goes into a very skeptical project of trying to construct an experiment or some kind of empirical research that will either confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. And if we get definitively results from our inquiry that support the hypothesis, then maybe, if we do it right, we send it off to a journal. The journal then subjects that argument to intense, critical, skeptical scrutiny. And then maybe it passes the next hurdle. Now notice we've gone beyond a single individual now. We've now gone with multiple individuals, and again, multiple individuals in the peer review process. And then ultimately what will happen is that not only does it get published once, but then another lab, other individuals, other academic departments, other scientists, other teams will then try to replicate those results. And they will try to corroborate that conclusion another way, through another method, through another argument, through another body of evidence, through another kind of experiment. And then slowly, through a period of process of this of replication after peer review, we start getting not just one argument that passes peer review of skepticism, but we get multiple arguments, we get dozens, we get hundreds of arguments, and maybe we get them across different fields in science, like in evolution, across geology and biology and microbiology and so on and so forth. And we get the results corroborated across all of these different cases. In each case, ideally, this is all ideal, it's being subjected to intense levels of skeptical scrutiny. And at that point, I think the way a very thoughtful scientist will talk about what results is say, we now have achieved a widespread scientific consensus that X is true. Smoking causes cancer. And we are as certain as we can be about that as we can be with any kind of empirical scientific claim because of the amassed evidence we've got in favor of it. Not to say we can be wrong, because sometimes we are in those cases, but we have an enormous mountain of good quality evidence in its favor. So now, calling that faith, I'm going to cry foul on the play. I don't think there's anything faithful about that. I think that is the ultimate example of critical, skeptical scrutiny being applied to our own reasoning abilities, and that is the highest quality kind of conclusion that we get with the human knowledge enterprise.
I agree with you, except for the problem is that simply by having the old adherents of the theory dying.
Well, that's just sociology of science talk, and I don't think there's a disagreement here with us about what faith is or what the problems with faith are.
What you're presenting is a hyper-realized concept of how science works. And science, having been a scientist, that isn't the way it generally operates. He said, there's enough...
We don't always achieve that idea, but what's your objection or question?
Well, the point I was trying to make is that in the public arena, there is nothing to distinguish between certainty through science and certainty through faith, but somehow you apply the standard that this is certainty by faith and it may be wrong when looking at scientific certainty. And that's what's going on now with global warming.
Yeah, I think there's weird things happen in these kind of highly motivated reasoning cases with Barton or some of the global warming deniers. Is that somebody, and I think you're right also about these guys being arguing in bad faith, so to speak, you mix the words here, because part of what's going on with those guys is that they're getting huge campaign contributions from oil companies. So they're highly motivated to resist the conclusion that there's global warming happening because their jobs and their livelihood and their votes all depend on their saying something different in public. So some of these guys are lying when they say that stuff. They're trying to keep their contributors happy. But that's a side issue. Now, one of the weird things happening then is that we're getting these arenas crossing. So I've been describing what I take to be a pretty accurate picture of the way faith gets used in mainstream, common cultural contexts. But a really weird thing happens, and I think you put your finger on it, when somebody who doesn't know his way out of a paper bag scientifically, like Humanists, is on a congressional committee hearing, and he's calling in to the hearing some of the very top, climatologists, meteorologists, scientists in the world, and calling them on the carpet and trying to be skeptical and critical about their standards of evidence and whether they've achieved. This is the Noah flood guy, is calling them out for not being skeptical. So you get a weird thing happen where he says, oh, that's faith, are you certain? And you get this weird, they sound like they're all speaking English, but these guys are playing very different games. So, they're not my issue, but there's some weird stuff happening there because the way the language gets used is very different.
Maybe you guys get a little bit more at the end, but let's do three more questions there, here, and then over here. All the way to the top. The top position.
The low battery is my favorite.
Just speak up.
Now? Okay, I used to coach soccer, so. This is great intellectual discussion for educated people that are rational and willing to see the other perspective. I deal with people on they do like them to hold business and stuff. They operate off of a whole different value set. They operate on an emotional level that they believe because it reinforces a positive view of how they've experienced life. And they have difficulty dealing with those events. It's really hard to get into any kind of intellectual discussion with them because they feel threatened because their view of the world now is starting to fall apart, and they quickly go back and put it all back together because that's a safe place emotionally. And I don't know. Best thing you do is leave them with maybe a seed.
Some people are lost.
Yeah.
You get to some folks early on in their lives, you get deep enough in their heads, and they're done. They're lost. They're lost cause. That's partly why I do the little test on the email thing. Because some folks want to fight, but they aren't really interested in having a conversation. I can offer this suggestion, and I don't know if this will work on anybody, but give it a shot. What if we then appeal to somebody? See if I can pull up my slide here. I don't have a faster way to deal with it. Here, I'll do it this way. I think it's possible to point out to somebody that by their own lights, by their own example, what they're doing is really peculiar. It's not consistent. Internally, they wouldn't do that. I think you can point out to somebody that their own, I'm trying to find
my slide that's got all the examples, the outrageous examples. Sorry. There. Oh, what happened? I thought that was going up there. You want to have it in? Thank you. Okay, so I think even for the Jehovah's Witness, and when you put polling data, those folks are some of the most intolerant, the least prepared to accept that there's any other possibility to be true. And there's not just me making this up, that when you look at and you measure people's religious attitudes along the spectrum, and you ask them things like, well, do you think that there are lots of ways to achieve religious salvation or redemption or divine transcendence? Or do you think there's like one and only one way to get there? And Jehovah's Witnesses register really hard on the my way or the highway range and scale. They're like, nope, this is it. You gotta do it this way or hell. My way, you're going to hell. That some of the least permissive about other ways to get to hell, to get to heaven. But I think what you can say, this may have no bearing or leverage on somebody, but you say, look, you wouldn't allow that kind of move. You wouldn't reason this way for your own sake, for your own goals, for the own things you want to achieve in your own life. Fixing your car, or paying your bills, or whatever. If the doctor came to you and said, all the evidence suggests that your engine block is crap, your blood test came back negative, but I have faith that you have cancer. You'd never accept that. You'd never accept a professor who said, oh, I know you got a 90 on all your homework assignments, but I've got faith that you got an F, so there it is, you got an F. You'd never allow somebody to make that kind of move in any other kind of case, where it really matters with money, your mortgage, or your life, or important stuff in your life. You never allow that kind of thing. But with the ambiguities and the vagaries of religious stuff, we're all like, oh, it's so touchy-feely. Well, that's okay. It's okay to have faith in that case. So I think you can point out to somebody, well, look, you're being internally inconsistent, and is it really to your own best interest to abandon what you would your normal policy, which would be to pay attention to the evidence, and you've now said about this particular thing, it doesn't matter, you're just going to believe it no matter what. Do you think it's best for you to do that? To just give up in these kind of cases? And if they ultimately say, I'm going to do this, and no matter what, well, there's only, you can't have leverage on everybody. You can't save everybody.
I've tried that, and that's why I have very many friends.
Yeah, this will make you a real jerk at parties. Nobody wants to be hanging out with you at parties if you talk this way. I am no fun at parties.
We'll do 2 more questions. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you the question about your definition. Paul Tillich, one of the highest, most respected philosophers of religion in the 20th century, wrote a book called Dynamics of Faith. I don't know whether you have read that book or not.
I know Tillich, but it's not fresh.
Okay, well, most of the stuff, I like to talk. Most of the stuff was you were attacking lightweights, though. Paul Tillich's not a lightweight. Paul Tillich is a heavy hitter in philosophy of religion. And he doesn't share your definition. Faith is not belief. It's not looking at, from his perspective, I'm talking from his perspective, faith is a state of being ultimately concerned about that which is truly ultimate. And as far as Tillich is concerned...
Yeah, that's what faith is. I got lots of that.
Yeah. So he argues that faith, a person who is truly ultimately concerned about that which is really ultimate, is going to have doubts, because you're going to want to be skeptical about everything, and you're going to want to be skeptical about your religion, because it's a matter of ultimate concern. I just want to recommend that you read that book, because I think you can incorporate it into your talk, and the next time somebody like me comes along, you'll be all ready to go. I mean, I know you know about...
Well, I wouldn't assume that I don't have an answer to you now.
Okay, well, then let me stop talking and give you your answer.
There is no question that there have been thousands of cases where somebody has written a book, influential and otherwise, and they have carefully crafted a particular definition and then proceeded to work all of those details out. And I got no issue with the general, relatively benign way that you're describing Tillich's position. being ultimately concerned with ultimate reality, first thing pops into my head is, well, that's a philosopher. And that means I got faith in truckloads, because that's all I ever think about. That's what I do. Now, I gotta say though, that I got the numbers with me on this. That way more people are saying stuff like that Afghanistan comment and that Detroit Lions comment. Normal, ordinary linguistic practice. Not politic, abstract, high-end, advanced degrees in theology, divinity school, echo chamber, talk about faith. Because I know there's like all kinds of really sophisticated stuff going on in there. And there's a lot of bullshit going on in there. But if I'm going to identify the target here, which I set out to do as, okay, what's the linguistic practice, the way people are using this term, I got millions more people on my side here, and I don't care what we call it. We can call it anything you like. I'm not hung up on the F word, that being the term, but I think that mine maps onto typical practice in 20th, 21st century America way better than that does. You go out in Manteca, walk down the street, and stick a microphone in people's face and ask them, what do you think faith is? It's going to map onto that thing that I've laid out way better than the Talmud does. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. I don't care. If we want to have a conversation about whether or not we're ultimately concerned with ultimate reality, that's cool. I'm interested in that. That's what science is doing. So science is faithful in that regard. But by that definition, the thing has just become kind of vacuous. That just means what every time anybody's worried about anything big, they got faith. So he's made everything into faith and then said this is in fact everybody's faithful.
Ultimate reality.
I'm interested
He's
then.
talking about ultimate reality. He's not talking about,
I'm interested. Look, we've now the number of evangelical Protestant Christians in this country has surpassed the number of Catholic and non-evangelical Protestants. We got like 35% population, majority population of Christian, 35% population of evangelical Christian. We got 130 million people in this country who are evangelical Christians, and I would venture to say that the majority of them are adopting a view that maps onto this account, and that's enough for me to do some work here. Now, we talk about tilling as another discussion, but that's important. That's like the real groundwork we got to deal with. The people disregarding evidence, which is all I care about. And Tillich sure as hell wouldn't urge you to disregard evidence and believe anyway. That's not what he's about. But that's what modern American evangelical Christians are about, and that's what we got to worry about.
So that's why I call them lightweight.
All right, and our final question tonight.
Okay, well, it's not really a question so much as an observation, but we could probably make a question out of it at the end. Okay, I want to touch on a couple of different things. You talked about people who use the notion of faith as sort of a way to invoke the idea that they have some other kind of knowledge besides the normal kind. I've heard friends of mine call that magic goggles.
This is just another way that's used besides some of the other camps.
Yeah, but there's also one of the things that I don't think you touched on, or if you did, I missed it, is and I'm going to kind of mix the words faith and belief here. The definition of faith that has to do with trust. So, for example, if I were to ask you the question, do you believe in me? That's a much different question than if I were to ask you, do you believe in ghosts, or do you believe in UFOs? I'm not asking if you believe, do I exist? I'm asking, do you accept me as a person of integrity, somebody who's reliable, trustworthy, whatever. So what I find is that a lot of believers have this mixed definition of faith. It's not just an empirical irrationality, it's a relational situation. They truly believe that their imaginary friend exists, so it becomes a relational question for them. It's not just, I believe that this guy exists. It's, I trust this guy implicitly. This guy's not going to steer me wrong. And what I noticed is that beyond the question of faith, there is a whole level of, like, I don't know what they call it, paradigms or axioms or whatever, but there's this whole level that involves trust that has to do with the locus of governance or the locus of choice. I'm very tired, so I'm sorry, I'm not articulating very well. Basically, what I've noticed is that, in a general sense, I'm going to generalize here, those of us who are atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, we value the ability to think for ourselves. we value the ability to think independently and come up with our own conclusions, to not have to listen to what somebody tells us and take that on face value, but to do our own research, our own investigation, our own contemplation, our own processing, and come up with our own conclusions. In the faith milieu, however, they put a higher priority on authority, on listening to authority, obeying authority, doing what you're told, believing what, the person who supposedly knows more than you has told you is the fact of the matter. So when you enter this dialogue, you've got all of these elements that are going on, that are percolating under the surface. And what's happening is that, when you're pitting something that, whatever your understanding of reality and the world is, even if it's scientific and it's validated by the fact that people have done this research, they've done these experiments, you can point to these things, you can cite these things, there's peer criticism, etc. To that other person, to that person of faith, to them it's basically like conflict of authorities. It's like you're saying, well, don't accept that authority, accept this one over here. Right. So I guess to turn my observation into a question, I could ask, what do you do with that? How do you break past that barrier? Do you understand what I'm saying? Or there's this inherent...
Give up. There is to it.
There's a bunch of very good insights, and you put your finger on another set of very common sentiments. And I'm not sure if I understand that well enough to be able to help unpack a lot of that. But I think there's no question that lots of these discussions that what gets revealed between Smith and Jones is that there's some really deep-seated differences in their values. And valuing skepticism, being reluctant to sign on and believe, being...
I mean, there's even things built into faith systems to denigrate and take you away from thinking for yourself.
Absolutely.
The heart of man is deceitful above all things.
So you're absolutely right, that between these two sort of worldviews, that there are strong sort of authoritarian threads in one that is sort of the flip side of the trusting business.
Yeah.
Trusting this establishment, trusting this book, trusting this tradition to give me the truth without my having to be too skeptical, versus the anti-authoritarianism, this sort of individualism that you're describing as part of sort of skeptical approach. So what you're talking about is, I think, what you're making me think about is that sometimes what's revealed here is that these two people have really different fundamental values along those lines. Mm-hmm. And what do you do about that, or what can you do about that? Well, look, if somebody doesn't want to adopt some of the basic values that are part of this sort of skeptical scientific picture, then I don't know what we can do. I suggested earlier about the Jehovah's Witness that one of the things you do is you appeal to their self-interest. And I've also argued that you appeal to this sort of notion of being a good citizen. Well, look, maybe you want this and you want to give it up, or you want to turn yourself over, or you want to just accept this stuff. But you realize how ripe for abuse this is, and you realize here's a bunch of really concrete examples of how that kind of lack of skeptical scrutiny gets us all into trouble. And you're my neighbor, you're putting people on the school board, you're teaching my kids in your elementary school class or whatever. So this is a joint venture for all of us, whether you like it or not. It's not just your personal business to have those sort of private interests and private goals, because there's no way for that not to spill over onto affecting the rest of us. You're voting, you're making decisions, global warming's happening, we got to do something, or, not until Shimkus is off the committee, right? So I appeal to their self-interest, appeal to their citizenry. I mean, part of what I was getting at, and I wrote this in the Manteca Bulletin, my little essay I wrote to the Bulletin last week, is I said, look, I urged those folks to come back out, not to, it turns out they were convinced that they were trying to repel the demonic attack on their town and this and that. Not to have this kind of supernatural battle, right, but to have an open discussion about the ideas, because this is the foundation of democracy. That a free society is built on the free and open exchange of ideas, including the minority ones, including the offensive ones, the ones that you find to be outrageous, They need to be given airtime, and they need to be considered in order for democracy to work. Now, if somebody doesn't care about that anymore, and some religious folks don't, they want a theocracy, they want to establish God's kingdom here on earth, and you can hear about some of these European countries dealing with the dilemma of sort of fundamentalist Muslims taking over their whole culture, and they're like, wow, what do you do when your primary goal was to give people freedom, and then what they do with it is say, we need to wipe out everybody's freedom, right? So look, there's some really fundamental values here about freedom, about democracy, about intellectual enlightenment, about your safety, your development as a human being, and your intellectual growth. So I suggested a whole bunch of different sort of tactics we can take to appeal to somebody to get them back onto the playing field so that we can now play by the rules again. Right? No, don't go over there, come back. You need to come back for all our sakes. You can't just leave the field or change the rules to get your way. It all matters for all of us because all our fates are intertwined. Wow, that's an inspiring way to look at it.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you.